I grew up listening to stories from my mother about her life in the southern United States. She often spoke of her childhood with a nostalgic air, describing the open fields, the long summer afternoons, and the sense of community that reigned in the small rural town where they lived. It always seemed like an almost magical place, full of simplicity and tranquility, a world very different from mine. My mother talked about her older brother David as someone charming and carefree, always ready for a joke or to defend anyone in need. But there was a void in those stories, a shadow that was never fully explained. I knew from a very young age that David had died young in his early 20s. My mother always said it had been a strange accident, a stray bullet that went through the window of the house and killed him. It was such a casual explanation that I never thought to question it. We lived in a rural area too, and although I had never heard of anyone dying from a stray bullet, I accepted the story because it came from my mother, and somehow it made sense in the context she presented. Years went by, and one day, when I was 16, something happened that shook the foundations of that version of the story I had accepted without questions. My grandfather, my mother's father, passed away, and the family began dividing the belongings he had left behind. In his collection of keepsakes, I found an old officer's sword from the Korean War. It was an impressive weapon with a sharp blade and a carved handle that spoke of another era, of honor and war. When I saw it, I felt drawn to it, as if it contained a part of my family's history that I wanted to discover. I took the sword home, proud of my new inheritance, but my mother's reaction was unexpected. Instead of sharing my excitement, she was visibly frightened. Her face tensed and her voice took on a tone I had never heard from her before. "It's too dangerous to keep it," she told me. "We should sell it or get a safe to store it." Her reaction puzzled me. I didn't understand why an old sword, which had probably been in the family for decades, affected her so much. There was something more behind her words, something she wasn't willing to share. Intrigued, I decided to ask my dad about the sword. I thought that maybe he could offer some explanation that my mother wasn't willing to give. But when I mentioned the sword, I saw something in his face that deeply unsettled me. An expression of sadness and pain crossed his eyes, and at that moment I knew there was more to the story of David, something that had remained hidden all those years. After a long silence, my dad finally told me the truth. There was no stray bullet, no strange accident. David had been brutally murdered in the 1980s. Apparently, he had gotten involved with some drug dealers in an attempt to make some extra money. He was young, ambitious, and like many at that age, he believed he could handle any situation he got himself into. But the world he had become involved in was much darker and more dangerous than he had anticipated. The dealers, according to what my dad told me, thought David had ratted them out, that somehow he had given information that led the police to bust one of their big deals. It was a fatal suspicion. I have no idea why they decided to use a sword to kill him, but they did. Perhaps it was some kind of message, something to instill terror and demonstrate their power. What I do know is that David's death was cruel and violent, and it left an indelible mark on my mother. What shocked me the most was learning that my mother had had to identify the body. All those years she had carried with her the weight of that experience, the pain of having seen her brother in such a terrible state, and having had to pretend that it had all been an accident, to protect me and perhaps herself from the horror of the truth. I found all this out when I was 16, an age where I was already starting to see the world with more nuance. But even so, it was difficult to process such a brutal reality. My mother never acknowledged it directly until years later. She continued to maintain the facade that it had been an accident, perhaps because that story allowed her to keep a certain emotional distance from the truth. Now that I'm the same age David was when he died, I can better understand his situation. He was just trying to make some extra money, introducing people who wanted to have fun to the dealers. It was easy work, fast money, and in his mind, he probably hadn't considered that something like that could cost him his life. Now looking back, I see how fragile that line is between what we think we can handle and what is truly uncontrollable. Every time I see the sword, which I decided to keep in a safe as my mother suggested, I think of him, of the decisions he made and how they led him to such a tragic end. I also think of my mother, of all she had to endure and hide to protect me, and how those secrets shaped our lives in ways we never could have anticipated. This story, which was once a mystery, is now a painful but essential part of who I am and my family's history. And although I wish things had been different, I understand that we all carry our own burdens, our own secrets, and that sometimes the best we can do is face them and learn to live with them. I was quite young when this happened, so the details won't be perfect. But the story is true. I grew up in a small coastal town, the kind of place where everyone knew each other and where life seemed to pass with unshakable calm. Our houses were lined along a quiet street with views of the sea that glistened under the sun during the day and whispered with the sound of the waves at night. My memories of that time are filled with days of playing on the beach, riding bikes, and sharing laughter with the neighborhood kids. Among our neighbors was a family I really liked. My parents were friends with them, and their children were about my age. We played together all the time, exploring every corner of the neighborhood as if it were our own kingdom. My friends' parents were kind, always offering us something to drink or letting us stay out a little later to play. It was a warm and welcoming environment, and I never thought anything could break that sense of security we had. However, everything changed one day abruptly. I clearly remember how all of a sudden my friends disappeared. They moved very suddenly, without any warning, without any clue as to where they were going. I was confused and sad. I didn't understand why they were suddenly gone. No one in the neighborhood seemed to have a clear answer, and my parents told me not to worry, that everything was fine. But the feeling that something didn't quite fit stayed with me. The strangest part was what happened afterward. Weeks after my friends left, I remember seeing some police cars parked in front of their old house. There were also moving trucks, and although I didn't fully understand what was happening, the atmosphere on the street was tense. My mother, who was always so open with me, became unusually reserved when I asked her about it. That was when she told me that the children's grandmother had gotten very sick, that the police had come to inform the family, and they had left immediately to take care of her. That explanation, though vague, made sense to a 5-year-old. I accepted what she told me, and although I missed my friends, I tried to move on. Many years passed since that day. Life went on, we moved away from that area, and the memories of my childhood in the coastal town were stored in a corner of my mind. As an adult, during one of those rare occasions when my family and I were reminiscing about our old home, I mentioned that I wondered what had happened to that family that moved so suddenly. It was then that my mother, with an expression that mixed sadness and doubt, decided to tell me the truth. The story she revealed left me frozen. That night, when my friend's parents had gone out for a date, they left their children in the care of a babysitter. The babysitter was just a teenager, about 14 years old, but she was responsible and trustworthy. While the children slept in their rooms, someone broke into the house. The police never discovered exactly who or why, but what they do know is that the babysitter apparently pretended to be alone in the house to protect the children. She tried to keep the intruder away from them, but in that attempt, she lost her life in a brutal way. When the parents returned home that night, they found the babysitter murdered in the living room. The scene they encountered was so shocking that, according to what my mother told me, neither of the parents could speak for what seemed like an eternity. Their first reaction was to run to their children's rooms to make sure they were safe. When they saw that the children were still sleeping, unaware of the tragedy that had just occurred only a few feet away from them, they knew they had to act quickly. The police arrived almost immediately. They knew that in such a small town, news like that would spread like wildfire, and the parents didn't want their children to wake up to discover what had happened. So, while the police secured the crime scene, the parents made a difficult decision. They wrapped the children in blankets, covered their heads, and asked the officers to remain silent as they carried them out of the house. The children, half asleep, didn't realize what was happening around them. Instead of explaining the horrible truth, they told them the same story my parents had told me, that their grandmother was very sick and that they had to move to take care of her. It was a white lie, one they believed was necessary to protect their children's innocence. The grandmother, true to her role, kept up the pretense for several weeks, taking in the children and making sure they didn't suspect anything. During that time, the parents searched for a new place to live, far from the town, far from the memories and the house that now brought them so much pain. Once they found a new home, they moved quietly, leaving behind everything they had known. My mother told me that she never knew if the children ever found out the truth about what happened that night. Perhaps as they grew up, they began to question the story about their sick grandmother. Or maybe the parents decided to keep the secret forever, hoping their children could live without the weight of that horror in their minds. That revelation shook me deeply. Everything I had believed about that sudden move crumbled. I realized then that the truth is often hidden behind well-intentioned lies, and that protecting the innocent sometimes requires difficult and painful decisions. Since that day, whenever I think of that family, I wonder how they dealt with it all. And although I will never know if the children discovered the truth, I hope that, in some way, they were able to find peace and continue with their lives, far from the terror that once loomed so close. My family has always been surrounded by surprising stories, the kind that make you question the thin line between reality and legend. But the story of how my grandparents met, how it all began, is perhaps the most shocking of all. It's a story I've heard in fragments over the years, a mix of whispers and half-revelations, but every detail I've discovered makes it more fascinating and complex. My grandfather was only 15 years old when he made the decision that would change his life and my grandmother's forever. He was a young, strong, and determined boy, with a will of iron that made him stand out among the others in his small town. At that age, most boys are busy dreaming about their futures, about the possibility of adventures and young loves. But my grandfather, instead, had an obsession that consumed him, getting my grandmother out of the convent where she lived. My grandmother, just a year younger than him, had been sent to that convent after being orphaned. She knew nothing about her family, not even a last name she could trace. For her, the convent was both a refuge and a prison, a place where she had found comfort in the daily routine, but also a place where she felt trapped, without a true home to belong to. As I was told, my grandfather had first seen her when he was helping with chores at the convent. The boys from the town were sometimes recruited to do heavy work, and it was on one of those occasions that their paths crossed. My grandfather was captivated by my grandmother from the first moment, and although they never exchanged a word during those first encounters, he decided that he wasn't going to let her spend her life locked up in that place. The story of how he rescued her, or more precisely, kidnapped her, is almost unbelievable, worthy of a novel. One night, under the cover of darkness and the silence only found in small towns, my grandfather arrived at the convent. He knew exactly which window was hers, as he had patiently observed it for days. With a mix of audacity and naivety, he climbed the stone walls, avoiding the few guards who protected the place. My grandmother, who at that time was 14 years old, looked at him with a mix of surprise and fear when he gently woke her. They had never spoken before, but he whispered that he had come to take her with him, far from the life that had been imposed on her. Although any other girl might have screamed or resisted, she, an orphan alone in the world, saw in my grandfather an opportunity for freedom, an escape into the unknown that, for some reason, seemed more attractive than staying in the convent. They fled together that night, crossing the fields under the moonlight. No one saw them leave, and by the time the sun rose, they were already far from the convent. The most astonishing thing about this story is that, the next day, no one bothered to look for them. My grandmother was an orphan, a girl without a name or family, and for the nuns at the convent, her disappearance was a matter they preferred to leave forgotten. Perhaps it was easier that way, avoiding the scandal and guilt of having lost one of their wards. They settled in an even more remote small town where no one asked too many questions. My grandparents' lives from that moment on were marked by hard work and mutual dedication. Over time, they had 16 children, each more resilient than the last, raised in a home full of love and discipline. My grandfather worked from sunrise to sunset, and my grandmother, although she never had the formal education she would have received in the convent, became a wise, strong woman deeply devoted to her family. I've always been fascinated by how two such young people could make such a radical decision, so full of uncertainty, and build a life together from nothing. I imagine my grandmother, a girl who went from the seclusion of the convent to the intensity of raising a large family in difficult circumstances, with no more guidance than her own instinct and the love she built alongside my grandfather. My grandparents' story is a testament to the strength of the human spirit, of how even in the most unlikely situations, the desire for freedom and to create something of one's own can lead people to do extraordinary things. Although what my grandfather did may seem impulsive and reckless today, for them it was the beginning of a life that, although filled with challenges, was also full of love, family, and purpose. Every time I think of that story, I can't help but feel connected to that legacy of bravery and determination. My grandparents, with all their imperfections and questionable decisions, taught me that life doesn't always follow the path you expect, but that it's possible to find the right way if you have enough will to seek it, even if that means climbing the walls of a convent in the dead of night. There are stories in families that remain hidden for years, buried under layers of silence and secrecy. Sometimes those stories come to light unexpectedly, and when they do, they reveal truths that change the way we understand our own past. The story of my uncle, who was actually my cousin, is one of those truths that emerged to redefine the family history. I grew up believing that my uncle was, well, simply my uncle. He was a loving and dedicated man, someone who was always present at family gatherings, who taught me how to ride a bike and who had a contagious laugh that lit up any room. To me, he was my mother's younger brother, the uncle every child wishes to have. I never had any reason to think there was anything unusual about his place within our family. But as with many things, the truth wasn't that simple. It was during a family conversation that, already an adult, I discovered the full story. I remember how we were sitting around the table, sharing memories and laughter when someone mentioned something about my uncle's past that didn't quite match what I had always known. It was a casual comment, but revealing enough to spark my curiosity. I decided to ask my mother about it later in private, and that's when she told me the story. My uncle, as I had always called him, was actually my cousin. He was born as the first child of my aunt, my mother's older sister. At that time, my aunt was young and facing many difficulties. Despite the circumstances, she tried to give her son the best she could. But tragedy struck unexpectedly. When he was just a baby, he was kidnapped. The kidnapping was a devastating blow to the family. The authorities searched tirelessly, but for an entire year, there was no trace of the baby. My aunt, already emotionally fragile, began to crumble under the weight of pain and despair. The family tried to support her, but the void left by her son's disappearance was too much for her to bear. That year of uncertainty and fear changed everyone involved forever. Finally, against all odds, the baby was found. He had been returned, but he wasn't the same baby who had disappeared. He had grown up in unknown circumstances, without the love and care a child should receive during their first year of life. When he was returned to the family, my aunt was unrecognizable. The trauma of the kidnapping, combined with the guilt and pain of having lost her son for so long, had transformed her. When she was faced with her son again, my aunt couldn't bear the idea of taking him back into her life. She no longer saw in him the baby she had lost, but rather a stranger, who represented all the suffering she had endured. She couldn't handle the emotional weight of raising that child, and in an act of desperation, she decided that she couldn't be his mother. That's when my grandparents stepped in. They couldn't allow the child to be abandoned or given to strangers. They decided to adopt him as their own, to give him a home filled with love and stability, which he so desperately needed. Thus, legally, he became my uncle, even though he was actually my cousin. My grandparents raised him as one of their own children, and they never made any distinctions between him and the other siblings. Over time, the story of his kidnapping and return faded into the margins of family memory. For all intents and purposes, he was my mother's younger brother, and no one questioned that reality. My grandparents gave him everything he needed, and he grew up to be a beloved member of the family. However, knowing the truth added a new layer to the relationship I had with my uncle. I then understood why there was always a certain sadness in his eyes, a melancholy I hadn't noticed when I was a child. My mother told me that he never spoke about those early years, not even with them. It was a topic too painful, something he preferred to leave buried. This revelation also made me reflect on my aunt's role in all of this. The decision not to take her son back must have been devastating for her. And while some might view it as selfish or cruel, I could understand that it was a choice born out of trauma and pain, not indifference. After all, the impact of losing a child, even for a short time, can be insurmountable. Today, when I think of my uncle, I see him with new eyes. I see him as someone who, despite a difficult beginning and an uncertain fate, found his place in our family and became the loving man we all knew. The story of his life is a reminder of how the darkest circumstances can give way to light, of how love and compassion can transform even the deepest wounds. And though he will always be my uncle, I now know that his story intertwines tragedy and redemption, pain and hope. It's a story that, though hidden for years, now forms a crucial part of our family's legacy. I grew up in a family that at first glance seemed like any other. There were 3 of us siblings, and being the youngest, I always looked up to my older brothers. They were my heroes, my role models. I remember that as a child I saw them as almost mythical figures, capable of anything, always strong, always invincible. However, as I grew older, I began to notice changes in them that I didn't fully understand. At first, the changes were subtle. My brothers started to distance themselves, spending more time away from home, surrounded by people who didn't seem like the best influences. I noticed their behavior becoming erratic, their moods fluctuating unpredictably. Sometimes they were euphoric, talking fast and laughing for no apparent reason. Other times they fell into a kind of apathy, as if nothing in the world interested them anymore. My parents, especially my father, seemed to handle the situation with an oddly calm demeanor. My mother, on the other hand, was visibly worried but rarely confronted my father about what was going on. I remember overhearing their hushed arguments, fragments of conversations about doctors and treatments, but I never fully understood what was happening. My father always said that my brothers were rebellious, that they had made bad choices, and there wasn't much to do but wait for them to grow up and realize the harm they were doing to themselves. For years, I accepted that explanation. I grew up thinking my brothers had chosen the path of drugs, that they had succumbed to bad influences, and that filled me with resentment. I felt like they had failed me, that they hadn't been the older brothers I needed, the ones who were supposed to protect and guide me. I distanced myself from them, unable to understand how they had let their lives crumble that way. Meanwhile, I clung to my father. He seemed to be the only one holding it all together amid the chaos. He was a man of principles, someone who had always led by example, and I deeply admired him for that. However, everything changed when years later I discovered the truth. It wasn't a sudden revelation, but rather a collection of small discoveries that gradually shattered the idealized image I had of my father. It all started when I found some old bottles of pills in the garage. They were dusty old bottles, but the labels were still readable. I didn't understand why they were there, but something inside me told me it wasn't good. I decided to investigate, starting by asking my mother. Over time, she had softened her stance toward my brothers, becoming more understanding and less critical. In one of our conversations, she mentioned something in passing that left me frozen. My father had been giving my brothers pills when they were children. It was something he did to keep them calm, she said. At first, I didn't grasp the magnitude of what she was telling me, but the more I thought about it, the more sinister it became. I confronted my mother with the little information I had gathered. She, initially reluctant, eventually told me what had really happened. My father had started medicating my brothers when they were around 10 years old. According to him, it was to help them focus, to control their excessive energy. In reality, what he was doing was sedating them, keeping them in a state of obedience and calm that, over time, became a necessity, a dependency. Those pills, which had started as a way to control my brother's behavior, became the root of their addiction. As they grew up and stopped receiving those doses regularly, they sought relief elsewhere in other substances. It wasn't a free choice. It wasn't a decision made in a moment of weakness, but the direct result of years of manipulation by my father, the man I had revered and admired. The resentment I had harbored against my brothers for all those years transformed into deep sadness and immense guilt. I had misjudged them, I'd blamed the victims without even understanding the truth. And more than anything, I felt betrayed. Betrayed by my father, whom I had seen as a pillar of righteousness and morality, only to discover that behind that facade lay a man capable of destroying his own children to maintain control. From that moment on, my relationship with my father changed forever. I could no longer look him in the eye without feeling a mixture of anger and pain. I distanced myself from him, and although I never openly confronted him about what he had done, our bond was broken in a way that could never be repaired. My brothers, for their part, continued to struggle with their demons, but at least now I understood where those demons had come from, and I tried to be closer to them, to support them in any way I could. I clearly remember when I first heard the story that my family had tried to keep silent for years. The first time I heard about my great-aunt's husband was at a family gathering, one of those where conversations become more intimate and secrets start to come to light after several glasses of wine. My mother, always reserved, was talking in a low voice with one of my uncles, and I overheard fragments of what they were saying. He killed her, fled to New York. Your grandparents found him. Curiosity was eating away at me, so I approached, trying not to seem too interested, but at the same time anxious to learn more. My mother looked at me and her expression changed. She knew I had overheard something, and after a moment of hesitation she decided to tell me the whole story, although with a warning tone that this was not something to share with just anyone. It all began in Puerto Rico, in a small town where my great-aunt lived with her husband. To everyone, they seemed like a normal couple, but there were rumors, the kind that are whispered in corners and that somehow everyone knows, but no one dares to mention aloud. According to my mother, the man's first wife had died under mysterious circumstances. The official version was that it had been an accident, but many in the town suspected there was something darker behind her death. My great-aunt married him shortly afterward, and her family wasn't entirely happy with the union. There was something about him they never liked, but my great-aunt was in love, or at least that's what she wanted to believe. The relationship was tense, and it didn't take long before things began to worsen. The fights became more frequent, and my great-aunt started showing signs of abuse, although she never openly admitted it. The family was worried, but back then and in that place, family interventions were delicate and often frowned upon. One night, the situation became unbearable. It's not exactly clear what happened, but what is certain is that my great-aunt ended up dead, and her husband disappeared. There wasn't a thorough investigation, perhaps because the local authorities didn't want to get involved in what seemed to be a domestic matter, or maybe because the fear of that man was too great. What was known is that he fled, leaving everything behind, hoping to escape the consequences of his actions. He fled to New York, thinking that in such a large city, he could lose himself and start anew, far from accusing eyes and vengeful hands that would surely come looking for him. But he underestimated my family. My grandfather, a man of strong character and determination, wasn't willing to let his sister's death go unpunished. Together with some of my great-uncles, they began to investigate, asking questions here and there, using their connections to track down any trace the man might have left. The trail led them to New York, where they finally found him. It wasn't easy, but when you have a purpose as clear as theirs, nothing is impossible. They found him living under a false name, working some mediocre job, trying to stay unnoticed. I don't know exactly what happened next because my mother didn't want to go into details, but what is clear is that they didn't let him escape. My great-uncles, men of few words and decisive actions, did what they felt they had to do. They didn't trust the justice system to take care of it, and at that moment, they believed they were the only ones who could make that man pay for what he had done. They killed him in some dark alley in New York. And then, with the same discretion with which they had arrived, they left. They returned to Puerto Rico as if nothing had happened, carrying with them the weight of what they had done, but also the sense of having done the right thing. The story remained buried for many years, whispered only in the closest family circles, until it eventually became one of those stories that the younger generations hear with disbelief, wondering if it really happened or if it's just a family legend. But I know it's real, and now that I know, I can't stop thinking about how those decisions, those acts, have shaped the history of my family. I grew up with a constant feeling that something in my family didn't quite fit. There was an uncomfortable silence, a sort of shadow that seemed to hang over us. Although I never knew exactly what was wrong, I could feel it in the way my parents avoided certain conversations, in the furtive looks they shared when they thought I wasn't watching. My childhood was marked by that uncertainty, but it wasn't until many years later that I finally uncovered the truth, and when I did, everything fell into place in a way that left me frozen. My parents had 2 children before I was born, but I never knew about them. In fact, I didn't learn anything about their existence until years later, when my aunt passed away and left me some of her personal belongings. Among her things, I found something that would change my life forever: the birth announcements of those 2 children. I stared at those yellowed papers, unable to comprehend what I was seeing. They were siblings I never knew, never mentioned, as if they had been erased from the family's history. The revelation hit like a punch. I felt the air leave my lungs and a cold sensation spread through my body. My mind began spinning in circles, trying to find an explanation, but the only one I found was too dark to fully grasp at first. I knew my mother had struggled with mental health issues. That was never a secret. Throughout my childhood, I had witnessed her episodes of rage, her unpredictable mood swings, her prolonged silences that could last for days. But I never imagined those problems had led her to do something so terrible. After finding the birth announcements, I knew I had to confront my parents. I couldn't continue living with that uncertainty, with questions that were eating away at me. I remember clearly the day I confronted them. We sat in the living room, the same room where I had spent so many days of my childhood playing, unaware of the dark secrets hidden within those walls. I showed them the papers, and the silence that followed was deafening. My parents looked at each other, and in that moment, I knew that everything I feared was true. When I asked them about those children, my mother simply got up and left the room. My father stayed, but he refused to say a single word. It was as if that silence said it all, as if the truth was too horrifying to be spoken aloud. That refusal to speak only confirmed my worst suspicions. I sat there in that room feeling more alone than ever, as a bitter truth settled into my mind. My siblings had died at my mother's hands. Over time, I discovered more details, pieces of a puzzle I never wanted to put together. My mother had drowned my siblings in the bathtub during a psychotic episode. It was a horrific, unimaginable crime, and though the authorities had arrested her, somehow she was released. Despite her history of mental illness, she was deemed fit to return home. Not only that, but a few years later, she had me, as if those atrocious acts had never happened. I grew up in that house, oblivious to the past, but always feeling a kind of inexplicable fear toward my mother. It's not that she was openly cruel to me, but there was something in her presence, in the way she sometimes looked at me with a coldness that made me shiver, that always made me feel in danger. My childhood was plagued with fears I couldn't name, nights where I fell asleep expecting something terrible to happen. Just before I turned 2, my parents had another daughter, but I never saw her, never heard her cries in the house, never knew what happened to her. It was as if that baby had never existed. My mother didn't talk about her, and neither did my father. It was another one of those secrets buried deep within our family, as if ignoring them could make them disappear. As I grew older, I distanced myself more and more from my parents. It wasn't just fear that kept me away, but a mixture of resentment and distrust. I knew something terrible had happened, even before I discovered the full truth. I felt it in the way my mother would fly into rages over insignificant things, in the way my father seemed more like a caretaker than a parent. When I finally had the chance, I cut off all contact with them. Not just because of what I had discovered, although that was a large part of it, but because I needed to get away from that toxic environment, from that constant feeling of walking on a tightrope. It was years later, when I returned to my hometown, that I decided to search through old newspaper archives. Something inside me told me I needed to know more to confirm what I already suspected. A friend came with me, and when we found the article that detailed what had happened, his reaction said it all. He was shocked, horrified by what he read. I, however, didn't feel surprised. It was as if my whole life had been preparing me for that moment, as if I already knew what I was going to find. My mother had committed a horrible crime, and the fact that she was allowed to have more children afterward, that she was allowed to have me, is something I will never understand. I'm not a judge, jury, or executioner, but what happened was an injustice, not only to my siblings but also to me. I grew up with traumas that still haunt me, with scars that will never fully fade. I look back and realize it was a huge mistake to let them try to raise another child. I'm glad to be here, to have survived everything that happened, but I can't help feeling a deep sadness for the ones who could have been my siblings, for what we all could have been if things had been different. Life taught me to be strong, but also to distrust, to question everything, even the people who are supposed to love us unconditionally. And though I no longer have contact with my parents, the shadow of what they did will always be with me, reminding me that evil can hide even in the places we think are safest. Since I can remember, I always believed my family was perfect. I grew up in a home filled with love, laughter, and happy memories, and that was what defined my childhood. Every Christmas, every birthday, and every family gathering felt like moments straight out of a fairy tale. My parents, Andres and Sofia, were the kind of people everyone admired, hardworking, kind, and deeply devoted to us, their children. There wasn't a single day when I didn't feel loved and protected. In my extended family, things were no different. My paternal grandparents had a large country house on the outskirts of the city, a place that became the epicenter of our annual family reunions. It was a magical place, surrounded by tall trees with a nearby lake where we would swim on hot summer days. Every summer, without fail, The whole family would gather there to spend a few weeks together. I nostalgically remember how my cousins and I would run across the fields playing hide and seek among the trees, or how we would sit around the campfire at night, listening to stories that my grandparents and uncles shared. My uncles, Carlos and Teresa, along with their 3 children, Alejandro, Sofia, and little Lucas, were a fundamental part of these gatherings. Carlos, my father's older brother, was a man with a strong but loving character. He always had a smile for us kids and would bring us little gifts every time he saw us. Teresa, on the other hand, was an elegant woman, always well-groomed and with an imposing presence. Their children were the pride of their lives, or at least that's what they showed the world. Lucas, the youngest of my cousins, was the center of attention at every gathering. He was a charming child, with golden curls and a mischievous smile that lit up any room. We all adored him, and no one could resist his whims. However, as I grew older, I began to notice that Lucas was different from us, not in his personality, but in his health. Lucas seemed to be sick most of the time. Often at family gatherings, my uncles would say that he couldn't join us because he wasn't feeling well. Sometimes he wouldn't leave his room all day, and when he did, he seemed tired and distant. I remember once when I was about 10, I asked my mother why Lucas was always sick. She looked at me with sadness and said he had a weak immune system, something that had caused him problems since birth. At the time, I accepted the explanation without questioning it, trusting that my uncles and parents knew what was best for him. But as the years went by, I began to notice other things. Things that, at the time, didn't seem significant, but later became pieces of a much darker puzzle. Like the way Teresa looked at Lucas when she thought no one was watching, with a mixture of impatience and something I couldn't quite identify. Or how Carlos sometimes seemed to lose his patience with Lucas for reasons that weren't obvious to the rest of us. These were small, fleeting observations that I quickly dismissed because, after all, they were my uncles, and I loved them. Everything changed the summer Lucas died. I was 15, and the news hit our family like a lightning bolt. My uncles announced that Lucas had died in a tragic car accident. I remember how my mother broke down in tears when she got the call, and how my father, who had always been the rock of our family, collapsed on the couch, unable to process the loss. Lucas, the child we had all loved and cared for, was gone, and there was nothing we could do to bring him back. The funeral was a heartbreaking event. The whole family gathered to say goodbye to Lucas, and the tears never stopped flowing down our faces. Seeing my uncles, especially Teresa, broken with grief shattered my heart. She, always so strong, so in control, was now a shadow of herself, trembling and sobbing beside her son's coffin. Carlos, on the other hand, seemed completely lost, as if life had abandoned him. That image of my uncles, devastated by the loss, was etched into my mind forever. In the years that followed, Lucas's memory became a delicate topic in our family. No one wanted to talk too much about him because every mention of his name brought with it unbearable sadness. Family gatherings became quieter, more solemn, and though we tried to move on, there was always an empty seat at the table, a space no one could fill. Several years passed before something reignited my suspicions. We were helping clean out my grandparents' house after my grandmother passed away. It was a sad time for all of us, but it was also an opportunity to reminisce about the good times we had spent there. While helping pack up old belongings, I went up to the attic to go through some boxes of keepsakes. That's when I found the box. It was an old wooden box with a rusty lock. It was hidden behind some dusty suitcases and looked like it hadn't been touched in years. I felt a strange pull toward it, as if something inside me knew that what I was about to discover would change my life forever. I forced the lock, and with a creak, the lid opened. The first thing I saw inside the box were photos. At first, I thought they would be family photos, perhaps pictures of us at some Christmas or summer gathering. But when I took them out and started looking at them, I realized they weren't normal photos. They were photos of Lucas, but not as I remembered him. In the images, Lucas appeared in a deplorable state, with bruises and scars on his body. His expression was one of sheer terror, as if he were living in a nightmare from which he couldn't wake up. Each photo I saw was worse than the last. Some showed Lucas chained, others with signs of having been beaten. A growing sense of panic filled my chest. What did this mean? Why would someone have these photos? My hands trembled as I went through the images, my heart pounding in my ears. Beneath the photos, I found a bundle of letters. They were letters written by Lucas, and when I read the first one, my stomach churned. The letters were desperate pleas for help, filled with details about the horrors he was living. Lucas described how his parents punished him, how they kept him locked up for days without food, how they beat him when he didn't do what they said. His words were full of pain and despair, and as I read, I realized the horrible truth. Lucas hadn't died in an accident. Lucas had been murdered. I sat in the attic, surrounded by those atrocious proofs, not knowing what to do. My mind couldn't process what I had discovered. For years I had believed my family was perfect, that Lucas had been the victim of a tragic accident. But the truth was far darker than I could have ever imagined. I spent days in shock, unable to speak to anyone about what I had found. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the images of Lucas, his face marked by pain, his pleas in the letters. I couldn't understand how my uncles, the people I had loved and respected all my life, could be responsible for something so monstrous. Eventually, I knew I had to talk to my parents. I couldn't keep that secret to myself, not after what I had discovered. One night after dinner, I called them into the living room. I knew it would be difficult, but I had to tell them the truth. "Mom, Dad, I need to talk to you about something," I said, my voice trembling. My parents looked at me with concern. They knew something wasn't right, but they had no idea what I was about to tell them. I showed them the photos and letters, explaining how I had found them in the attic. As I spoke, I could see the disbelief on their faces. My mother put a hand to her mouth, her eyes filling with tears, while my father turned pale, unable to process what he was seeing. "This can't be true," my mother whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. I don't know," I replied, feeling a lump in my throat. "But if this is real, then Lucas didn't die in an accident. It means they killed him." My father looked at me with an expression of deep anguish. He was a strong man, but at that moment he seemed completely broken. "Pia, this is very serious. Are you sure these letters are real?" he asked, still searching for a way to deny what he was seeing. I nodded, though deep inside I was still struggling with the idea that this could be true. The thought that my family, the people I had loved and trusted my whole life, could be involved in something so horrific was too much for me to bear. My parents and I spent hours that night going through the box, reading and rereading the letters, looking at the photos in more detail. Each new letter we read, each new photo we saw, confirmed what we least wanted to believe. Lucas had been tortured for years, and the people who had committed those horrific acts were none other than my uncles, Carlos and Teresa. My parents were devastated. They didn't know what to do, whom to turn to. Finally, after many discussions and tears, they decided that the only thing they could do was take the box to the police. We needed an investigation. We needed justice for Lucas, even if it came too late. The following days were a nightmare. My parents and I went to the police station and presented the evidence we had found. The officers listened to us attentively, though at first, they seemed as incredulous as we were. But when they saw the photos and read the letters, their attitude changed. They knew they were dealing with something serious. The investigation began almost immediately. The police interrogated my uncles, and although they initially denied everything, the evidence was too overwhelming. Lucas's letters, the photos, medical records showing he had suffered multiple injuries throughout his life. Everything pointed to the same terrifying truth. A few days later, my uncles were arrested. The news spread quickly through our community, and the perfect family that everyone admired was exposed for what it really was: a facade, a lie built to hide the horrors happening behind closed doors. My parents were heartbroken. They lost their brother and sister-in-law in one blow, and the image they had of their own family was destroyed forever. But what hurt them the most was realizing that they had lived so many years without knowing what was happening, without being able to save Lucas from his tormentors. The country house where we had spent so many happy summers was sold shortly afterward. None of us could bear to go back to that place, knowing what had happened there. Our family fell apart. The family gatherings, once full of laughter and love, became a distant memory, replaced by an uncomfortable silence and a sadness that would never fully disappear. Now, years later, I still struggle with what I discovered. I am haunted by the thought of everything Lucas had to endure, how no one heard him, how his suffering went unnoticed for so long. Sometimes I wonder if I will ever be able to trust anyone again, if I will ever be able to believe in the goodness of people. But what scares me the most is knowing that evil can hide in the most unexpected places, even in families that seem perfect. My story is a warning, a painful lesson about the importance of looking beyond appearances, of questioning what we take for granted, and of never stopping in the search for the truth, no matter how painful it may be. The truth, as I learned the hard way, always comes to light, and when it does, it can destroy everything we thought we knew. My father's first cousin is a serial killer, Kenneth McDuff. We watched the episode of America's Most Wanted when it aired, and we were shocked to find out about a McDuff without knowing he was a relative. Imagine that your family had always been close-knit, a blend of humble origins and deep-rooted values, where everyone seemed to know everyone. Family gatherings were always lively, filled with shared stories and laughter. But one summer afternoon, when everyone was gathered in the living room, something changed. The television was on, tuned to an episode of America's Most Wanted. It wasn't common for the family to watch that kind of show, but that night, something in the air seemed to suggest it was the right thing to do. As the show unfolded, a particular news segment caught everyone's attention. A man named Kenneth McDuff, wanted for being a serial killer. At first, the name didn't mean much. It was just another name, one more among the many that flashed across the screen. But as the narrator began detailing his history and showing his face, the atmosphere in the room shifted dramatically. A heavy silence fell over the family when one of the aunts with a pale face muttered, That's Aunt Margaret's son." Suddenly the horror of what they were watching became personal, very personal. Kenneth McDuff, a man they had vaguely known as a distant cousin, a familiar face at occasional family gatherings, turned out to be one of the most brutal killers in recent U.S. history. The disbelief gripped everyone. How could someone from their own family be capable of such atrocities? The episode continued, breaking down McDuff's crimes in detail, and with each revelation, the horror deepened. He wasn't just a murderer, he was a monster, someone capable of unimaginable cruelty. The stories of his victims, the way he hunted and killed them, seemed like something out of a nightmare. And yet there was his face, the face of someone who shared blood with them. After the program ended, no one spoke for a long time. It was as if the words were frozen in everyone's throat. Finally, your father broke the silence. "We never knew him well. But still, it's incredible to think that someone from our family..." His voice trailed off, unable to complete the sentence. That night changed everything. The family began to recall the few times McDuff had appeared in their lives, the small encounters that now seemed filled with a threat they hadn't noticed before. They remembered how there had always been something strange about him, a sense of unease that had led them to keep a cautious distance. However, no one had imagined what he was truly hiding. The childhood stories, the anecdotes about him, began to be reevaluated under a new, darker, more disturbing light. Over time, the family tried to move on, but the name McDuff was never spoken without a shadow of fear and revulsion. They became that family, the one with a serial killer in their family tree. And though they tried not to let it define them, the truth was always there on the fringes of their lives, a haunting reminder that even in the closest families, unimaginable secrets can be hidden. The impact of that discovery echoed for years. The trust in what family meant wavered, and the stories shared at family gatherings carefully excluded any mention of McDuff. But the memory of that America's Most Wanted episode never fully faded. Whenever a program about serial killers appeared, someone quickly changed the channel, as if by avoiding it, they could escape the dark stain that had fallen upon their family. However, from time to time, in private conversations and whispers, the question arose, what if someone had seen the signs earlier? Could they have done something to prevent the tragedy? That uncertainty, that lingering doubt, was perhaps the cruelest legacy McDuff left them. I discovered in my 30s that my mother hadn't just had 4 children, but actually 6. I had always thought I knew my entire family history, that I understood where I came from and who my siblings were. But as I learned, families sometimes hide secrets that challenge our understanding of what we think we know. I grew up in a household that, although not perfect, was relatively normal. My mother and stepfather made sure we never lacked for anything essential, and my 3 siblings and I shared a childhood that, while with its ups and downs, was stable. I never questioned the family structure. I accepted the narrative that was presented to me. 4 children, a hardworking mother who married a man who supported her, and a life that, while modest, was enough. But secrets have a strange way of coming to light when you least expect it. It was during a family gathering, one of those organized from time to time where everyone attends with a mix of excitement and obligation. We were in the kitchen, my mother, my aunt, and I talking about life, about how everything had changed since we were kids. It was in this context, in what seemed like an innocent conversation, that my aunt casually dropped a bombshell. "Do you remember when Mom had to give the first 2 up for adoption? I never knew what happened to them," she said, almost as if she were recalling just another anecdote. The silence that followed was deafening. My mother, who was in the middle of preparing a salad, stopped chopping and stood still. I felt the ground disappear beneath my feet. "2 first?" I asked, my voice trembling. My mother sighed and, without looking up, began to explain. It turns out that before meeting my stepfather, my mother had 2 children from previous relationships. It was a difficult time, and she didn't have the means to care for them, so she made the decision to give them up for adoption. She had never told me about them, and I had never suspected their existence. And then, as if that revelation wasn't enough, she dropped another bomb. When she became pregnant with me, she had intended to give me up for adoption as well. The news hit me like a train. For years, I had believed that my arrival into the world, though unexpected, had been welcomed. But now, knowing that I had been considered for adoption left me with a feeling of rootlessness. What did that say about my place in the family? Was I just the product of a mistake, an accident that was eventually decided to be kept? My mother continued speaking, explaining that she had changed her mind when she met my stepfather, that he had insisted she keep me, and that they would form a family together. Somehow, that didn't lessen the pain of knowing that at one point, I had been a discardable option. Weeks passed before I could process everything I had learned. My siblings and I talked about it, trying to understand our mother's past, the decisions she made, and how they affected us. It was a strange time, as if the ground beneath our feet was no longer as solid. But as often happens, life has unexpected ways of surprising you. A few years after all of this came to light, we received an unexpected call. It was one of the babies my mother had given up for adoption. He had been searching for his biological family and had finally found us. The news shook me, but in the best possible way. Meeting my new brother, I felt an instant connection. We shared more than I could have imagined, the same features, the same way of laughing, and even some of the same interests. It was as if, despite the years and the distance, there had always been a part of us that was connected. Since then, I've had to rethink what family means. It's not just blood that binds us, but also the decisions we make and the connections we choose to strengthen. My new brother has been an incredible addition to our lives, and while the story of how we came to know each other is complicated, I'm grateful for the opportunity to have him in my life. Now, I look back and see everything differently. My mother's story, the decisions she made, and the fact that I was almost given up for adoption, all of it is part of who I am today. It's not a perfect story, but it's mine, and I've learned to accept it with all its complexities. At the end of the day, what matters is the family you have, no matter how you came to be a part of it. My uncle didn't die in a car accident. He killed his lover and then killed himself by crashing his car with her body in the trunk. It was a story that had been carefully buried by the family for years, a dark shadow that no one wanted to unearth. However, secrets have a strange way of coming to light, and when they do, they bring with them the truth that had been hidden for so long. It all began with what seemed to be a tragic car accident. It was a rainy night, the kind of night when roads are treacherous and visibility is low. The news came early the next morning. A car had violently crashed into a tree on the outskirts of town. Inside the vehicle, emergency services found the body of a man, identified as the family's uncle. The initial diagnosis was clear. He had lost control of the car in bad weather conditions and died upon impact. The family was devastated. Everyone knew him as a kind and loving man, someone who always had a smile to offer and who had never shown signs of being troubled or in any kind of danger. His death was mourned as a tragic and inexplicable loss, one of those misfortunes that no one could have foreseen. But, as often happens, the truth didn't take long to emerge. A few days after the accident, the police made a chilling discovery. In the trunk of the wrecked car, they found the body of a woman. At first, she was believed to be another victim of the crash, but the circumstances quickly pointed to something much more sinister. The woman had been strangled before the crash. There were no signs that she had died in the impact. In fact, she had been dead long before the car hit the tree. The investigation intensified, and what came to light was more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. The woman in the trunk wasn't a stranger. She was the uncle's secret lover, someone he had been involved with in an extramarital affair for years. No one in the family had known about her, or at least no one had admitted to it. Everything had been carefully hidden, as if the secret was too dark to share. Over time, the details of what really happened began to trickle out. The relationship between the uncle and his lover had started passionately, but like many forbidden love stories, it had quickly deteriorated. The fights became more frequent, the encounters less satisfying, and eventually the relationship became unsustainable. On that rainy night, everything had reached a breaking point. No one knew exactly what words were exchanged, what had finally pushed the uncle over the edge. But what was known was that, in a fit of rage or despair, he strangled her. Perhaps it was remorse, or maybe hopelessness, that led him to make the final decision. After killing his lover, he placed her body in the trunk, got into the car, and drove down the road in the middle of the storm. He sped through the rain, tears blurring his vision as much as the darkness outside. When he reached a dangerous curve, he didn't attempt to turn the wheel. He slammed into the tree at full force, knowing that the final impact would end everything. When the family finally learned the truth, they were shattered once again, but this time for very different reasons. The story that had been told at first, the one about a tragic accident, was replaced by a much darker reality. No one wanted to talk about it, but the gossip in town didn't stop. Rumors spread like wildfire, and what had started as a tragedy turned into a public scandal. Years passed, and although the memory of that accident faded from the community's mind, for the family, the pain and shame remained. No one spoke of the uncle, no one mentioned his name at family gatherings, and his photos disappeared from the albums. It was as if, by erasing his memory, they were also trying to erase the darkness he had brought upon them. But in the darkest corners of whispered conversations, the story still lives on, a silent warning of how secrets and lies can lead to the most terrible consequences. And although the family has tried to move on, the truth of what happened on that rainy night remains a reminder that the past, no matter how much you try to bury it, always finds a way to come to light. My parents took me to Disneyland for my 7th birthday. I remember arriving at the park and having a fantastic first day or two. Then my parents had to leave and make a bunch of phone calls. They sounded really stressed and kept telling me that nothing had happened and that everything was fine. Finally, we flew home, and surprise, we took a couple of extra days to go to a big water park far from home. I remember this birthday fondly and eventually forgot any oddities. Maybe 10 years later, my parents finally told me what had happened. My uncle, my dad's brother, had tried to commit suicide on my 7th birthday. He shot himself in the stomach with a rifle. He was poor, addicted to drugs, unemployed, etc. He felt depressed because my dad had the life he had always wanted, so he tried to kill himself. He ended up surviving. My parents took me to the water park so we wouldn't have to go back home with him just getting out of the hospital. By not telling me, my parents allowed my birthday to remain my day, not the day my uncle tried to die. Knowing how the mind of a 7-year-old works, I probably would have thought that I had something to do with it. My grandfather was always an enigmatic figure to me. I knew he had worked as a coal miner his whole life and was deeply involved with the union. At family gatherings, when people spoke about him, it was always with a reverential respect, almost as if he were larger than life. I assumed that respect came from his role as a union leader, someone who fought for workers' rights in a harsh and dangerous environment. But after his death, I discovered there was much more beneath the surface of that image. When he died, his funeral was massive. People from all over the country came to pay their respects. My grandmother, always stoic, seemed colder than usual. She didn't cry much, at least not publicly, and remained upright and dignified throughout the entire process. Everyone talked about her strength, how she had supported my grandfather through decades of union struggles, and how now she would be the head of the family. It was after the funeral that things started to get strange. My brother, who was 16 at the time, recalled an afternoon when he was at our grandmother's house. A man, dressed in a black suit, appeared without warning. My brother saw him enter, speak briefly with our grandmother, and then hand her a thick envelope. He couldn't hear the conversation, but he noticed that the man wasn't a common visitor. There was something about him, in the way he moved, in the way our grandmother treated him, that suggested he was someone important, someone not spoken of openly. My grandmother took the envelope, put it in a drawer, and said nothing. The next day, she announced that she was going to take a year off to travel through Europe, a dream she had always claimed she wanted to fulfill, but had never had the chance. We were all surprised, but we didn't say much about it. She had lost her husband, and in our opinion, she had every right to take the time she needed to recover. It was a strange year. My grandmother sent postcards from Paris, Rome, and many other cities. Each postcard was a glimpse into her apparent enjoyment of life. She told us about the museums she had visited, the gardens she had strolled through, and the interesting people she had met. But there was something in those postcards that didn't quite fit, a coldness, a lack of emotion that unsettled me. One day, while I was helping my mother clean my grandmother's house for her return, I found a box hidden in a closet. It was small, wooden, with a lock that had already rusted. What I found inside took my breath away. A collection of old photos, all of my grandfather, but not in his role as a miner or union leader. These were photos of him with men dressed in suits, some visibly armed, and others in what seemed to be construction sites, but of a different kind, more clandestine. Among the photos, there were letters. The handwriting was my grandfather's, and in them he referred to jobs he had done, matters he had resolved. They were cryptic letters, but clear enough to understand that my grandfather had not just been a miner and a union man. He had also been a man of action, someone the union called upon when things needed to be settled definitively. He spoke of blowing things up and making sure certain problems stopped being problems. The realization of what it meant to be a union man began to descend on me like a heavy blanket. I then understood that the respect everyone had for him didn't just come from his union leadership, but from something much darker. He was the type of man people turned to when words were no longer enough, when force was the only solution. And now, the mystery around his death and my grandmother's behavior began to make sense. When my grandmother returned from her trip, she seemed like a different woman. She was more distant, more reserved. I didn't mention what I had found, but I felt that she knew that I knew. We never spoke of it, but our conversations were always more cautious from then on. Over the years, my grandfather's story became a sort of family legend, although one that wasn't told often and always in whispers. For many, he remained the heroic union man, the defender of workers' rights. But for me, he was always something more, a man who navigated the dark waters of power and violence, leaving behind a legacy that, though filled with respect, was also tinged by the shadow of the actions he took in the name of that respect. That box with the photos and letters, I kept it. Not because I want to keep that dark side of his story alive, but because it's part of who he was. And though I don't always understand his decisions, I believe there is something to learn from them. In the end, my grandfather was a complex man, and his story, like all human stories, is full of nuances. I grew up believing that my grandmother had lost her leg due to an aggressive cancer, an illness that had weakened her and ultimately forced her to amputate to survive. That was the story I was told as a child, and for years, I never questioned it. After all, my grandmother was a strong woman, someone who had faced life with a toughness that only experience can bring. But it wasn't until much later, when I was an adult, that I discovered the truth behind that loss, a truth that completely changed my perception of her and the family's history. In her youth, my grandmother was a robust and hardworking woman. My grandfather, on the other hand, was a severe man, with a stinginess that bordered on cruelty. He was never an easy man to deal with, and his attitude toward money defined him in many ways. His obsession with saving every penny led him to make decisions that, over time, destroyed more than just the family's finances. They also destroyed my grandmother's life. One particularly hot summer, the roof of their house began to show signs of wear. The tiles were cracked, and whenever it rained, water seeped through, creating damp spots on the walls. True to his nature, my grandfather decided they wouldn't pay a professional to fix it. Instead, he would handle the repairs himself. And as always, my grandmother would be by his side, helping with whatever was needed. I was told how that day she climbed onto the roof with him, carrying heavy tools and helping him replace the damaged tiles. It was a hard, even dangerous task, but my grandmother didn't complain. However, in a moment of carelessness, she lost her balance and slid off the edge of the roof, falling to the ground with a scream that echoed through the street. The fall was brutal. She severely injured her leg, and the pain was unbearable. Neighbors rushed to help, and soon she was taken to the nearest hospital. There, the doctor explained to my grandfather that her leg was seriously damaged, but with the proper treatment and surgery, it could be saved. However, the treatment wasn't cheap, and at that moment, my grandfather made a decision that would change my grandmother's life forever. "We're not spending that money," he said with a coldness that still chills me to remember. "Cut it off." The doctor tried to reason with him, explaining the implications of an amputation and how it would affect my grandmother's life, but my grandfather didn't flinch. To him, the cost of treatment was an unnecessary luxury, and he preferred the cheaper solution no matter the suffering it would cause his wife. And that's how my grandmother lost her leg. Not to an uncontrollable illness, but to the stinginess of a man who valued money more than the health and well-being of his wife. The recovery was long and painful, and my grandmother was never the same again. Although she learned to live with a prosthetic, the loss of her leg deeply marked her, both physically and emotionally. But my grandfather's cruelty didn't end there. After the amputation, his treatment of my grandmother became even more ruthless. Not only had he left her mutilated, but he also began to beat her. I remember hearing stories of how, in the middle of the night, my grandmother's screams would break the silence of the house, but no one did anything. In those days, things were different. Domestic abuse was a subject people didn't talk about, let alone intervene in. My grandmother endured years of abuse, years in which her strength was tested over and over again. She never spoke about it directly to me, but when I looked into her eyes, I could see the pain and resignation she carried inside. Despite everything, she kept going, taking care of her children and grandchildren, trying to maintain an appearance of normalcy in a life that was far from it. It was only many years later, when she was older and my grandfather had passed away, that my grandmother began to talk more freely about her life. In one of those conversations, she told me the truth about how she had lost her leg, and it was as if a veil had been lifted. The story I had known all my life crumbled, revealing a much harsher and heartbreaking reality. That revelation changed the way I saw my grandfather, and more importantly, the way I saw my grandmother. She wasn't just a victim, she was a survivor. Someone who had endured the unimaginable and had come out the other side with a dignity that few could maintain. Her strength didn't come from having overcome an illness, but from having survived a personal hell created by the person who was supposed to protect her. Today, when I think of my grandmother, I can't help but feel deep admiration for her resilience. The story of how she lost her leg isn't just a story of loss, but also of the incredible willpower she possessed. It's a life lesson that, though painful, has taught me to value the strength and endurance that often hides behind the quietest people. My grandmother didn't just lose a leg, she lost part of her life and spirit, but she never lost her dignity. And that's something I'll never forget.